Sorry about that. Yeah, probably.
Probably. That's okay.
Yeah. Do you think it's necessary in here?
I don't know. Depends on your voice.
Okay. I'll give it a try.
You give it a try. Give it a try.
But difficulties. I'm here to show you all how to use a laptop. Okay, so yeah, sorry we're starting a little bit late, but I'm not in a hurry, so we have plenty of time for questions and stuff after I talk at you for a bit. So, all right, I'll just get right into it. Hello, impressionable young minds. My name is Ryan Duffin. I'm a waterfall.
It's probably the.
I want to actually get a picture of everybody before your eyes glaze over. So if you want to make a funny face or rude gesture, it's all behind me, so I won't know. Okay, sorry. So I'm Ryan Duffin. I'm an animation lead at DICE. Is this too loud? Is that not loud enough? Everything good? Cool. All right. So I work on Battlefield 1 currently, the downloadable content for it. Before that, I worked on Battlefield 4, Battlefield 3. Most of my prep was for the main conference talk, which I'm giving tomorrow. That talk is aimed at more people over the hump of into the games industry. For today, the student day, I wanted to focus on what it takes to get you guys over that hump into the games industry. I didn't really have a lot of guidelines of what I was supposed to talk about, so I'm just going to talk about what I want to talk about, and hopefully there's some benefit for you all. I want to talk about establishing good, smart habits for a healthy, flourishing game development career. Unfortunately, that means there will be less practical examples like I'll have in the talk tomorrow. You can see those at KONSOLL if you'll be there. Let's see. Let's see how to make this thing go. Uh-oh. Sorry, 1 second. I know. Here we go. Okay, so I wanted to give a long time for Q&A after this. This talk did go longer than I intended it to. It's probably going to be about a half an hour, and then there'll be time for Q&A. And you can ask me about anything about this talk or anything about games industry, and I will answer to the best of my ability, as long as it's not secret stuff, which there isn't too much of right now. And Azek will be here helping me, letting me know if I'm talking too fast or when we get into the Q&A part, talking about different experiences and his perspective on things and mine. So between the two of us, hopefully we'll be able to answer all your questions. With that in mind, if you think of anything during my talk, I encourage you to write it down or put it in your phone or something and ask afterwards. Just to get a feel for the crowd, is everyone here a game dev student? Is it? Yeah? Cool. Game dev teachers? Cool. No? Game dev and teacher? Okay. So who am I and what right do I have to talk about any of this stuff? Sorry, this isn't fully full screen, but whatever. I was sort of a goofy, creative kid, like I'm sure all game developers were. I was always into making stuff with Legos and drawing and role-playing games, stuff like that. I was always really fascinated by the idea of making characters and worlds, so kind of led me into this. There was a part of me that wanted to become a mechanic, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. In the early 90s, Jurassic Park and Terminator 2 came out, CGI animation, and that was like a religious experience for me and just sort of set me down the path of doing 3D animation. In 1999, I went to the DigiPen Institute of Technology in Redmond, Washington, which was also conveniently my hometown. Despite my bad grade point average from high school, I had to actually write a letter explaining why I wanted to get into game development for them to accept me, because they thought I was a bad student. I got in. A couple of years later, I graduated. I went to work at Treyarch. This was in 2001, working on the Spider-Man games. That was 16 years ago. These are some of the games I've worked on since. I have that's a 16-year career of studios big and small. I have 19 shipped titles, one crappy movie. Green Lantern was 27% on Rotten Tomatoes. And then four of those 19 have a Metacritic score in the 50s. So, and only one of these games I worked on for over a month, but you know, you get the credit. And I'm only explaining this so you have kind of a good idea of what you can expect from even a pretty good career in game development. You are going to work on some stuff that sucks, probably. Only one studio closure, so I've been lucky in that regard. There's a lot of people who have been doing it this long who have experienced that a lot more. So I didn't originally plan to give 2 talks until just a couple of weeks ago. Sylvie asked me, and I was a little worried that I'd signed up for a double scope at the last minute, which is very thematically appropriate for the things I'm going to be talking about here. But I realized I could give a shorter, student-focused version of my console talk. Believe it or not, it will be shorter. More about an efficiency mentality in the way that you work. And I want to bring attention to bad habits that I see in students and seasoned game developers alike. I haven't spoken too much to a student audience, so hopefully this is all still relevant, and if it's not, then the Q&A part hopefully will still be helpful. There is a lot I want to say to the next generation of game developers and things to hopefully break some of the habits that I've made and mistakes I've made and I've seen made. I wound up, in preparation for this talk, I wound up making a whole bunch of brainstorm notes and wound up with like 5 talks worth of content that I've hopefully whittled down to 2 hopefully useful ones, but I should be getting to that soon. Tomorrow's talk will be much more nuts and bolts. Today is more high-level theory stuff. So the talk tomorrow is called Reduce, Reuse, Recycle. The console talk is a reference to springboarding from your existing features, working smart. That's less relevant for a student crowd. So that turned into work fast, work smart, no mercy, sir. It's more about a general smart work habits. This is definitely relevant to you guys. I know these are stupid names. I just steal pop culture things to name my talk, so I don't have to name them myself. I don't know if anybody even gets the reference. It's for the Karate Kid, 1984, the old one. Americans were really into karate in 1984. So as students, I'm sure you've heard work hard millions of times, and that is solid advice. There's no epiphanies there. This is a very small and competitive industry. Success won't come easy. But the point I want to make today is that not all hard work is equal. We work in an industry that prides itself on killing ourselves for our art when we should be more proud of having a long, healthy career of making lots of great games, each one better than the last. There's a lot of legitimate rumbling about the ever-expanding scope and budgets of games. How can AAA even survive? How can indies survive when we're constantly getting more and more complicated? We can't throw infinite time and money at these problems. We have to do things better, and we have to do them faster. So I'll get into it further with the console talk, but I've been thinking about this subject a lot this year as we worked on In the Name of the Tsar for Battlefield 1. It's a Russian expansion that just came out, I think, last month. We worked very hard on this pack, but a lot of the stuff we were able to do was also because we were working smart. We usually worked smart. I don't want to make it sound like we didn't make any mistakes. I think I'll talk about some of those. In that talk, I'll be showing some videos from Battlefield. For this audience, I hope my time will be better spent ranting and then answering questions. And you can see the videos tomorrow. It's a timely topic. There's been a lot of stories in the gaming press about this. Game developer secrets and cheating players. transparency blowing up in our faces. If there are any games journalists here, please don't be a part of the problem. We're just trying to elevate the craft. And the reason I have any interest in public speaking at all is because I want games to be better than they are. So, I think some gamers, and worse, some games buy into this notion that every feature must be real and true, artisanally crafted, non-GMO experiences, etc. And a lot of that backlash to this is completely misguided, I think. The only truth for the player is the experience. So, final little bit of preference before I get into the meat of the talk. I am one person in the games industry with a specific skill set and a specific story. And everything I'm about to talk about is an opinion based on my experiences. A lot of talks from developers, especially focused to students, are trying to say this is the way it is, or this is the way it is. This is the truth of the matter. But there's many different truths. I'm not going to deviate from the things that people tell students in these talks. You know, don't be a dick. Work hard, be amazing at your craft. I don't know if can I talk like that here? Is that okay? All right, cool. Work hard, be amazing at your craft. Really, don't be a dick. But there are dicks in game dev. There are lazy people. There are people who aren't all that good at what they do. They make it. There are exceptions to this rule. I highly discourage that being your ambition to be any of these things, but people have succeeded, unfortunately. So there is no gospel truth about the games industry. Gather all the information that you can and make your own truth. Finally, the message. It's about time, right? There's three parts to this, and this is still framed in the reduce, reuse, recycle context of my talk tomorrow. One, doing things the most efficient way. There's a figure of speech. There's many ways to skin a cat, and I don't know where that comes from, and it's kind of gross, but it means that there's more than one way to do things. There's not usually one right way that's going to be clear. This is especially true in any creative pursuit like writing a book, making a game, or putting together a talk for KONSOLL. But there are probably ways that are better or worse than others for the situation. There are ways that are faster and slower. The point is to reduce the amount of work that you have to do to reach a goal. And a huge part of this is proper pre-production and planning. That should have its own slide, but it would kind of throw off the flow, and I've got enough slides already. Second, leverage the work that you've already done. You don't have to make everything specifically for a singular purpose. Often you can get 90% of the way there with something you already have. This is especially important in pre-production or gray boxing for levels and things like that. There's a story about the Knights of the Old Republic game. This is really old now, but BioWare's game, they actually built the entire game in the Baldur's Gate engine, which was what they had at the time, while another team was making the KOTOR engine. So they were proving out all their gameplay and the flow of everything while they were doing the tech at the same time. The last year of development on Knights of the Old Republic was basically porting that game to new tech. That, to me, is a perfect example of working smart. You will very often not have what you need when you're starting off, and you'll have to make things. That's expected. But when you make things that are not disposable but recyclable. Think beyond the intended purpose of that thing. Think of the potential future reuses that may not currently be in your requirements. I think it's very dangerous to make features for a very specific design spec. I think you should future-proof your solutions by making them flexible. Build them to be reused. And the last point is shaving weight. I know this is a little out of place with here, but this is another way of reducing your workload, but on a micro scale. I think this is really important at the point that you all are at, just establishing good work habits. Shaving weight is a term from racing. Weight matters in racing. The less weight you have to move, the easier it is to move, the faster you go. It's basic physics. But once you've gotten rid of the obvious extra weight in your workflow, how do you shave off more? At this point, you probably can't take 10 kilos off one part, but you can take 1 kilo off of 10 parts. And this is where scripts and hotkeys come in, small optimizations to your workflow that make big time savings. So the first step I want to talk about is reducing. I'm going to tell a little story. Those who know me know that I have a reputation for bad analogies, and I also have a problem about talking about cars too much. I didn't mention this earlier. I love cars. It's kind of an addiction for me. I was working in Sweden, and I had an opportunity to stay in Sweden or move back to Finland, where I worked before, and instead I moved back to the US so I could finish working on a car. I'll try to make it quick, and I promise the entire time I'm still talking about game development. So this is one of my project cars. This is a 1963 Chevy station wagon. I have weird taste in cars. It's a beautiful car, I think, but it's slow, it has bad mileage, it smells like gasoline, it handles bad, it stops bad, it's scary to drive. As a thing to look at, I think it's pretty cool. As a thing to drive, it's kind of a piece of shit. So my goal is to take this old piece of shit and make it an awesome car that is fast, efficient, reliable, stops good, corners good. I wanted to make an old car that performs like a new sports car. And before you think I'm talking nonsense, let me reframe things a bit. My car is the product, the game. And there's a lot of steps to rebuilding a car, and there's not a set of instructions to follow. There are maybe for parts along the way, but not the whole thing. It's not structured, just like game development is. Rather, it's as structured as you decide it's going to be. Please forgive the commercial connotations of the word product. Project would actually be more comfortable, but I like product because it implies a finality. It implies that you're going to be done with it at some point and then move on to something else. The story makes the most sense with that in mind. So a few weeks ago, I was working on a feature for this particular product, and I thought, oh my God, this is what my whole talk is about. Old cars had skinny little tires. I'm going to try and gloss through this part quickly because I know it's a little off topic, but not quite. If you want your car to stick to the road when you're racing, you want big fat tires with more contact for the road. Old station wagons didn't leave a lot of room for big fat tires. Fat tires are the direction. I know what it is what I want, I'm just not sure how to get there yet. The way to do this is going to get a little technical, I don't know. You cut out the old metal and you replace it with new metal, or you move the old metal in and fill the gaps with other metal. Mini tubs are the feature to address the direction. This is how we get the big fat tires that we want on the product. All that's left now is the work. So what I could have done is spend a couple $100 and bought those things and it save a bit of work. Let's call it something gamey sounding because I am stretching a little bit here. Let's call it a prefab or a base mesh, some asset from the last game that you already made. But instead, I moved in the metal. I bought these strips to do it. I know how to cut. I know how to weld. I have the skills to handle this feature. Let's call me the overconfident developer or the short-sighted developer, the inefficient developer. Definitely not the lazy developer. I wanted to work at the top of my skill level and push myself. And I don't want to make it sound like pushing myself is a bad thing. It's not. But I'm not trying to be a metal fabricator. I'm trying to build a car. I'm trying to ship a product or a project. So I cut and I grinded and I welded. It didn't take long to see that I was in over my head. I installed one, then the other. The second one turned out so good that I realized how bad I'd done the first one. And I had to cut it out and do it all again. I had overestimated my ability to deliver the feature, and I had to go back and redo it. And because I'd already used that metal, I had to use scrap metal this time. If I had a boss on this project, this is the part where I'm in trouble. It's actually where I realized I'm in trouble. I was in trouble for a long time now, but this is just when I know it. So I would have slipped my deadline. I would have let my team down. But it's worse than that because this is an indie project. I'm only accountable to my own time and my own money. No one but me is going to stop me from making my mistakes. So this is where I'm at today, pretty close to done with the metal fabrication. The left picture was the aspiration, the middle is the reality, the right was the Frankenstein monster of the result of doing it wrong the first time. The left would be a little more money and taken 2 days to install. The way that I went was slightly cheaper and took me 8 days. The diagrams here are all the extra cuts and extra welds that had to happen to make this work. The same feature, executed without forethought and planning, took 4 times longer, at least. This is something I do in my free time. I'm pretty busy, so I don't get a lot of time to work on this kind of stuff. But here's the really insidious thing about this, and pay attention. when I'm in there cutting and grinding and welding, it's actually fun. Like, I'm getting dirty. I'm making progress, millimeter by millimeter, but progress. I am working hard. In game development, this could be writing and rewriting a design document endlessly or noodling with a walk cycle for 2 weeks. It is dangerously easy to lie to yourself about how much you're actually accomplishing when you feel like you're accomplishing anything. But because I didn't step back and I didn't see the big picture, I didn't plan the production and assess the risk and take the shortcuts, I'm still working on these stupid mini-tubs when who knows what I could have been doing in that time instead. There's certainly no shortage of other features, just like in any creative project, but there's absolutely a shortage of time. I didn't let a boss down, I didn't blow a schedule, I let myself down. That's time I wasn't working on other things to get me closer to the finish line. And 10 years from now, when I'm hopefully driving this thing down the road, I'm not going to be thinking about which way I did that. I'm going to be thinking about, man, this thing sticks to the road. It's worth mentioning that I'm a lot more confident in my fabrication skills after doing this, but that wasn't the goal of the project. The point was to finish the car. I have other cars I want to build. The middle car, that's mine. I did that. It's still not done. I'm almost 40. How many more cars am I going to build if I'm working 4 times slower than I could be? So hopefully this makes some sense. I'm not telling the story to share an existential crisis. Or maybe I am. But building cars and building games aren't that different. In game development, it's very easy to get lost in the process of creating. The process is fun. Day-to-day work is fun, but it's not always the most productive thing. It's easy to lie to yourself about how much you're actually accomplishing. These kind of stories matter because some developers, students, and especially the public has a stigma about anything they see as a shortcut. Whether it's prefabs in Unity, base meshes in ZBrush, digital inking versus pens, these are features. They can help you to get to your direction. You got into games, I assume, to make games, to finish games and make the next one. There's some artistic hubris in having to make something from scratch every time, but you never make anything from scratch. You don't make your own pencil or make your own paper. So this swings right into my next point. I'm done with the car story, by the way. Sorry for the, wasn't even a tangent. Reuse something what you've already done when it makes sense to. The most efficient way to make something is to have already made it. It can be writing your own game engine for something that Unity's already done a perfectly functional prefab for. At KONSOLL, I'll be talking a lot more about throwing new meat on an old skeleton, but for now, just trust me. I don't want to spend too much time on this point for a student crowd because this is more of a point for a production environment, not an educational one, so don't think I'm undermining your teachers or your projects. When I was in school, we weren't allowed to use Biped for 3D Studio Max for my whole first semester, and that was so we didn't develop a crutch for the easy way. After that, we did, of course, but the teacher didn't want us to rely on it. So for students, this is a real common example of failing to use what you have access to. I come from an animator background, so that's going to be my bias. But a common example is feeling like you have to model and rig every character for your animation demo reel. But if you're aiming to become just a specialized animator, you don't need to do this. And in fact, you might be hurting yourself by doing so if you're not a great modeler and you don't even care to be. Don't waste your time on demonstrating the skills. Don't waste your time demonstrating skills you're not really good at and don't really want to be good at. It's better to show a great animation of an untextured rig that someone else made than it is a great animation of a bad model and bad lighting. I made this mistake on my student demo reel, by the way. Another thing was editing to music. Don't do that too much either. If you're aiming to be a generalist, it is different, but only show your good work. That's the main point I want to make. You still have to put in the work, but put the work in the right places. Work smart, then work hard. Things like if you're making a student film or a student game, there's 100% value in doing as much of it as you can. This is a process about learning. The goal of a student film or game is to learn the craft, and I'm not trying to talk you out of that. Your university years might actually be the only time you get to do that in your life, so take it. But the point of a demo reel is to demonstrate a specific skill, and when we're reviewing your demo reel, we're probably not going to watch a whole short. This habit exists in the games industry. Most commonly is wasn't made here and wasn't mine. This comes up when it's like, yeah, our sister studio made this great rigging tool, but I don't like the hand controls, so we're going to rewrite the whole thing. Or I don't like this pose library, and let's just make our own. And this is surprisingly common. Wasn't mine is the same, but chronological instead of geographical. This is when you get the new creative director in and they don't like the old script, so they change it, or the new tech artist doesn't like the old exporter. Sometimes it exists just because people believe something new is expected. We can't just reuse the same animation from the last game. Why not? So if you made something good enough the first time, why would you change it just to change it? That's a breath of life you stole from something new that you could have made instead. So I'm going to give a few quick examples from Battlefield. We added a shield for one of the expansion packs, and the shield, under the hood, there's of course new animations to it, but under the hood it's a rocket launcher. We have common sets of animation, and we didn't have one that worked for a shield, so we just found something that was close, and that worked. Same thing with a bow that we added for Battlefield 4. The bow is a pistol with a bit of grenade logic applied to it for hold and release. But we didn't have to write new systems for this, and we wouldn't have been able to do it if we did. Smart reuse of work applies even on a feature level. If Symphony of the Night came out today, do people know this game? Awesome. Okay, good. If Symphony of the Night came out today, you might see a Kotaku article cry foul that half the world is just the other half flipped. Spoiler alert. Excuse me. Some of the press and now some fans think the developers cheated you out of a different half of the world. But they didn't. They doubled the world. They didn't have twice the team and twice the budget. They didn't ship the game early and take a vacation. If they didn't do this, the game would just be half as long. So Symphony of the Night is kind of a masterclass in this. One of my other favorite stories about reusing things is from Modern Warfare 2. I believe this is Modern Warfare 1 as well, but they had a rule about set pieces. It's a very difficult to work with engine, and so doing stuff like this is hard. So their rule about set pieces is we don't do anything like this unless we use it twice. So in this case, we can do this cool snowmobile chase, but we have to use it again as the Zodiac chase at the end of the game. Back then, the teams were a lot smaller. I'd be kind of surprised if they still do this, but there's no reason not to. It's working smart. It's making sure that something that you're going to put your time into gets sufficient usage by the player before you invest in it. I think this is especially important for assets and systems. I'm telling you all, the blank slate is overrated. It will never be easy to build something great, but it's always easier when you start with something good. This is true in the big picture and the small. Reinventing the wheel doesn't always serve the game experience, and it usually doesn't. My last point, and this is a quick one, shaving weight. What small things can you do to work smarter every day? Identify the repetitive actions in your work and make them faster. Every program you use daily or even weekly should be permanently pinned on your start menu. Perforce has hotkeys. I don't know if anybody's using Perforce yet. Remember those cut lines I showed you earlier on my car? Imagine that's your screen. How many kilometers a day of mouse dragging does not using hotkeys cost you? The first thing I do when I sit down with a new Maya install is set or reset the hotkeys for soft scan, graph editor, outliner, set key, toggle playback. Working without these at this point feels like running in cement shoes. Make shelves, make scripts, identify where you're slow and attack the problem, and attack it now. Whenever you feel your mind going faster than your hand, you need a hotkey. There was a talk last year by Dan Lowe at GDC called the Animate Button. I highly recommend it. I think it might be free on the GDC Vault. It really opened a lot of people's eyes to the degree, even for professionals, of which repetitive actions in production just waste time and could be automated. I don't have too much to say on this point other than to be aware of it. It's just a mindset. You should always be thinking to work faster. Moving towards the home stretch, I want to talk briefly about why this matters. The first is professionalism. What this has to do with professionalism, well, when you go work for a company, which some of you probably aspire to do, you owe it to them to work as efficiently as possible. My friend Simon Unger has a great quote on this that I'm about to completely butcher. When you're being paid to make a thing, it's no longer your thing. The faster and better the thing is made, regardless of process, makes you more valuable as a thing maker. It's weird English. If you work for yourself as an indie, the professionalism is doubly important. It's harder to move along with some producer breathing down your neck, but it's no less important. While you may not fire yourself directly for underperforming, if you don't ship some games and make some money, you might very well be out of your job. Now, there's a lot of valid negative criticism of game developers, but be assured, lazy people don't ship games. Accusations of laziness are easy to address. You just need to work smart, because when it comes to the scope of a project, the house will always win. It's so rare to ship something that is perfectly finished and to the intended spec that in my experience, it's purely hypothetical. Just like my car will never truly be done for someone like me who tinkers, your game will probably never be done until it ships. And it sure as hell isn't going to be done early. Working smart gets you onto the next feature sooner. Every shortcut you take is an opportunity to do something new. It frees you to spend more time on the harder and more important features. There's going to be a small tangent. I added it at the last minute based on some peer feedback, but this industry glamorizes killing yourself, suffering for your art. Your egos as creative people are ripe for exploitation. Some people will gladly work you to death if you let them. Don't let them. Working smart is how you can be more productive in 40 hours a week than the next person is in 60. There is, of course, a system of ethics to all this, and it's actually pretty simple. Spend your finite time and resources on whatever gives your player the best experience. I would argue that if you're remaking something just to remake it, you're actually serving yourself more than the player. You've just cheated them out of whatever else you would have made in that time instead. You may love writing renderers, but is that the best use of your time when you just want to ship a Sudoku game on the iPhone? There's no objective truth as to what should be reused and what's worth making new. That just depends on you and your project. Just always keep in mind what work is going to be most appreciated to the player before you invest your time in it. Now, of course, there's a couple of caveats here. One is hobby projects, and this includes a lot of the educational work you guys are doing. Projects where the point is to learn. This is something that you all should be doing, of course. If your hobby project is writing a game engine just to do it, do it. And especially as a student, you'll learn a lot. Making short films, same thing. Just look at the big picture and whatever you're working on and be able to answer why you're doing things the way that you are. If you're making a game for fun, do whatever's fun. I mean, that cutting and grinding and welding I talked about earlier, that's fun. If this wasn't a student talk, I wouldn't even bother to include this, but just to address any possibility of misunderstanding me, I'm advocating cheating in a cheeky way. We're magicians performing tricks. We cheat to deliver to our viewers. But don't steal stuff. Shortcuts are good. Stealing is bad. It's a small community, and the internet lives to catch people doing this stuff. You won't get away with it. Don't steal. Speaking of stealing, I stole all these GIFs from YouTube, and some of them are GIFs that other people made of animation I did, so I don't really know what the ethics of that is, but thank you, YouTube. Borrow. Definitely borrow. Borrow from your past work. Borrow from your old projects. Borrow from the last game that your studio shipped. And collaborate. Find peers online, collaborate with fellow students. If he's a good modeler and she's a good animator, hey, there's a good chance for you both to show off. This is one of my favorite quotes. Perfect is the enemy of good. You'll never ship everything you want. You'll never be totally satisfied. Maybe this is my malcontent nature projecting, but I can't imagine shipping something that I think is perfect. When I hear somebody say they ship something perfect, I just think they're full of themselves. The road we walk is littered with corpses. I'm not suggesting that these games didn't launch specifically for the reasons I've gone over now, but I bet money there was a lot of bad processes in all of these projects. Vaporware isn't generally because the developer discovers the idea was a bad one after executing it for a couple of years, but it's just a failure to execute at all. I mean, a tongue-in-cheek first-person shooter could have been great. I know this isn't technically vaporware, but should have been. A Metal Gear Solid gameplay in the StarCraft universe, that should have been amazing. It was probably a failure to work smart. And I'm not speaking entirely from an outsider's perspective on these failures. I said I've shipped 19 games. I've also worked on at least 3 games that never shipped or were finished by another studio. Vaporware isn't usually a tragedy. except of the developer's hubris. Failed games are so common that there's a lexicon around it. Especially when you're new and inexperienced, you need to know that your first game isn't going to be as good as it is in your head. But by your second game, it's going to be a lot better. Your third game, closer still. An art teacher once told me everyone has a million bad drawings in them. You just need to get them out of you as soon as possible. It's done when it's done is this sort of glamorized notion of perfectionism. When you get to the place that John Carmack has, you can say stuff like that, but none of us are there yet. So this talk turned out to be longer than I intended it to be. It's almost done. Just keep in mind what you're trying to make. Have a plan how to get there. I can't stress that part enough. Have a schedule, have a roadmap, have a deadline, and reality check it often. Keep in mind the big picture the whole time. The game is bigger than whatever part of it your nose is currently in. I've seen multi-million-dollar projects fail because they never bothered to look beyond the next step and then they walked right off a cliff. None of us are above making these mistakes. I know I'm ending dark, but Norway has long winters and great metal bands, so I think you can handle it. I hope so, because I'm about to get a little darker. Video games are made by a finite amount of people over a finite amount of time with a finite amount of money, except Rockstar Games. You as creative people doing creative work have no shortage of great ideas. You have stories to tell and experiences to share, but you have a finite amount of time on this earth. You have a finite amount of projects you'll complete in that time. You're here because you're creative people, and if you're anything like me, you're probably not going to finish all the projects you have in mind right now, let alone the stuff that comes along down the road. Life is short, the clock is ticking. Don't cheat your players, but don't cheat yourselves. Make things that are awesome and make as many of those things as you can. Don't mistake work for progress. That's it. Thank you. And now we have time for questions. That actually came in shorter than I thought. We've got one right here. If it doesn't work, I can just repeat the questions. Are we recording this? Yeah, we are.
Hello?
Oh, good to know.
I was wondering, since you are mostly working on AAA games, I would assume, do you feel limited in your creativity, even when you're working on games that you feel are more successful than, let's say, games like Duke Nukem?
Right. That's a great question. So on the credits thing, since we're not in a hurry, I'll probably give rambling answers a little bit. On the credits thing, you saw that I worked on the one movie, and when I did that, that was 10 years into my career, and I just wanted to find out what working in film was like. And that experience was so structured and uncreative that I had no desire to do it again. It was 2 months of this pixel, that pixel. Where in games, I feel like I have a lot of creativity, especially with the work I do in Battlefield. Yeah, I'm working on teams of hundreds of people, but the part that I get to own is enough that I feel pretty creative in it. Probably about as creative as you could get in AAA without being the boss. I mean, you find your part and you own it and you put as much of yourself into it and make it yours and impress people to the point that they trust you to do those kind of things. And in that regard, I mean, whether it's building a level or an animation system or something like that, then yeah, I think you can definitely feel very creative in that. Does that answer your question? Cool.
To both of you, really, since you've both been involved in various projects from what I've understood, what is your proudest moment in games development so far?
Do you want to go first?
Sure.
I'm still thinking of mine.
Difficult to say proudest moment. I think the first game we shipped I was very proud of that, Tesla Grad, because I work at an indie studio, so my projects are a lot smaller than Ryan's. But just shipping your first game and putting it out there and seeing reviews on like the video game media and like seeing people enjoying the game, that felt like a really big milestone.
I have a hard time picking favorites, partially because I have a terrible memory. But I'll go with one specific case. I had a slide that I pulled out of here that this was, a lot of this talk was sort of the counterpoint to a talk that I gave last year called The Illusion of Proficiency. And it was all about doing your research, basically. It was a more animator-focused talk, and it was about making sure that you aren't underestimating your player's perception of things or knowledge of things. Like if I'm making a football game, soccer or football, it doesn't matter, that I shouldn't assume that what I know about that game is the most that anybody knows about that game. That if you know more about football than me, I need to hold it to your standard, not mine. So the inspiration for that talk was when we added that bow to Battlefield 4, and I took a day off and took archery lessons all day and shot hundreds of arrows, and I actually bought a bow after that because it was so much fun. But so when the videos went up on YouTube of the bow, I troll the comments. I shouldn't. I don't troll them, but I look. Somebody was like, "Oh, you know, he opens his hand in this kind of grip when he has the bow, and it's because all of the weight of the bow is on the string. The gravity doesn't matter at that point." So somebody pointed out, like, "Oh, he would drop the bow if he held it like that." And before I could come in and correct them, and maybe I would have, I don't know, but people were like, "I'm actually an archer, and this is actually correct." They did it right. So when somebody finds something wrong, and then when the fans come in and correct them, that was a real proud moment for me. I'm a little contrarian, so.
Why in Battlefield 1 the horse, when you shoot it, why doesn't it die before the enemy? Like if you shoot on the enemy, like it die before the horse. If you're in the tanks and shoot on the horse, the enemy die before the horse. Why?
Balance. The simple answer is balance. There's I'm listening to the Great War podcast, not the Great War podcast, the Hardcore History, which is fascinating about World War I. But one of the things they talked about very early in the war is discovering that cavalry, World War I was the war that cavalry didn't work anymore. So actually riding into combat on a horse when the other guy has a tank is really, it's not great. But if we did that in game, there'd be no point to having the horse. So you have to be a little tougher when you have a horse. It's a super horse.
Another fast question. If you throw like AA mine on the tanks, it's destroy like this, and if you take it, throw on the horse, it doesn't destroy. Why?
That I don't know. I think it only sticks to metal. Maybe I think it's supposed to be magnetic. The horse isn't. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that I'm probably more than a lot of game developers. I'm an advocate for realism and believability as long as it is not at the detriment of gameplay. But in these cases, I have to agree with the designers that it'd be no fun. You would never get on the horse if it would die as fast as it should die, and then it would be no point for us to add it. And so some things just get fudged for the balance.
I think it's an interesting thing that you, like as a student, and previously I worked in television, working on project where you're trying to strive for realism or like believability in a story, that kind of thing. Contra working with like game systems and like you said, balance. It's a thing that you don't notice while playing the games if it's done right. If it's balanced and it's fun, then you don't think about it as a problem unless like you have situations like the horse where it's like obviously a break from reality in a game that is sort of feels very real. But as a developer, you're constantly dealing with this. Like, should I animate in this way that looks more real, or should I animate in this way which feels better?
Or communicate something to the
communicate
player better.
something in a clearer way, or like is more fair to the contest that is actually taking place underneath the visuals.
The balance between believability and realism and gameplay, that's the eternal battle of game development. There's one story. Well, it's probably okay to tell it. One of the games that I worked on that did not ship. It was a Silent Hill game. It was for PSP. This was 10 years ago, and at one point they wanted to put a 4-story parking lot in the middle of Silent Hill because they wanted a quick time event for it or something. There was some like, oh, we need a 4-story parking lot, but Silent Hill's a small town. It doesn't really make sense to have a 4-story parking lot. So it's like, at what point is it ripping you out of the experience that like, oh, this is a great quick time event, which I don't think anybody's ever said that. With like, oh, what the hell is that doing? Oh, we need a skyscraper in the middle of some middle of nowhere town because of gameplay. It's like there's never a right answer. It's just going to be how well you make your case.
You are very an advocate for games being a creative medium, mostly it seems through your presentation. But would you say that it is just as possible for a designer to sort of approach games from a more logical standpoint and think of it as a logical problem more than a creative problem?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, sort of, for example, taking myself as an example, I am not raised in a creative environment in the same degree as maybe many others. My father is a biologist, my mother is an economist. I did maths, a lot of maths. I'm good at the logical side of stuff. So when I look at video games and sort of look at the problems I see, it is much more based on sort of logics, numbers, all this stuff, more than the creative design aspect. Would you say that is as of a appropriate approach to game design and creating games as your more creative focused approach?
Absolutely. I mean, there's room for all kinds of games, and there's the difference of Uncharted and Sudoku. It's like one is not more valid than the other. It's just they scratch different itches. It's like a romantic comedy versus an action movie or whatever. There's room for all of it. I think I wish I could remember the talk. It was a GDC talk from David Rosen from Wolfire Games. He makes Lugaroo and a bunch of other cool stuff. But he was talking about the indie space and indie games that try to compete with AAA games, and kind of what the folly of that was. If you were trying to make, you probably shouldn't make like the low budget Battlefield, because if it's the same game, we have more money, so it'll probably show better. It's just how it is. But Battlefield isn't. He had a big diagram of like here's where like it is on these different spectrums, and the difference of Uncharted and Battlefield and Call of Duty and Tomb Raider and all these, like they're all in the same sort of action space. They're not that different. Where indie games can be whatever, because you don't have to appease shareholders. You don't have to sell tens of millions of units. Like you can make any kind of crazy game, and you should. That's where indie's the strongest, I think.
I just wanted to add, like, I always feel that, especially after starting working in games, I feel that like saying that engineering can't be creative is sort of wrong. It can have creative solutions to maths problems.
Absolutely.
So it can be creative. It's just a different sort of skill set that you use in a creative way. You have to sort of be creative to solve problems. If they're a visual problem or like an engineering problem, it doesn't really matter. It's still a creative process. So.
I think too we have one in the back too.
Do you have any more questions, or do we want to say something first?
One other thing, I think sometimes our industry can hold the artsiness, can maybe cherish that a little too much. There was one in the back too. I think he was first. But like, I mean, the whole point of my talk here is working smart, and a lot of that is being organized and doing spreadsheets and stuff like that, and the stuff that sucks. But the stuff that sucks is what gets you working faster, and so I don't think that should be undervalued. I mean, most game studios have an open office because we value communication and the open flow of ideas, but you don't think a game into existence. You have to make it. You have to do the work. So at some point, you know, people need to shut up and start typing. So
if you were to create Battlefield 1 on PlayStation and Xbox only first, but then you decided to take it to PC as well, how long will it take? Porting and developing the game onto the PC.
that direction is generally easier. It would depend. This is a totally unofficial statement, and I'm not an engineer, so I can't say specifically, but going console to PC is generally a lot easier than PC to console. The biggest thing, and this is probably like the #1 mistake that people make when talking about, like, oh, just do this thing, or why don't you have a button for this? When we have parity of PC and console, we have less buttons on consoles. So if you make a PC game and then you port it to PlayStation, you might have to rethink your entire user interface. A big thing that catches us in animation is that we don't have analog sticks on PC generally, so we need to support like walk animations in Battlefield, even though no one will ever see them on PC. On Battlefield 3, we had a way to, this was a great example of inefficiency actually, you could deploy your gadgets, but only on PC, because there wasn't enough keys for it on console. And there was no point to doing it anyway. Everything was like if you have a medic bag, there's a button to quick throw a medic bag, but on console there's no button to switch to carrying around your medic bag. Because you can quick throw, it was completely pointless. But because we supported it on PC, I had to go in like the last few weeks of production and animate crawling around with a medic bag in your hands. And that was really stupid, so that was a big waste of time.
So, we agree that a game needs to have balance, but if you had a choice, said for instance, with a game like Uncharted or Call of Duty, what would you prioritize between reality and, well, gameplay or story?
That's a difficult question. I think reality doesn't matter. I know I said
creative.
Authenticity, but reality, like, it's a big thing for animation, and I think it carries over into game development, but reality is not what we're concerned about in animation. We're concerned about believability. And I wish I had some examples here, but there's a lot of things that you can watch videos of that if I were to animate them, it would be bad animation. There's gifs of like people falling down or contortionists doing impossible things that if I were to animate that, you wouldn't believe that it's possible. Only because you're seeing the real thing, is it real? So believability, I think, is the big point, not realism. Plausibility, or things that don't pull you out of the illusion, but sometimes reality could pull you out of the illusion. So the difference of believability and sorry, what was the other half of just the fun and gameplay side of it? It just, I mean, it depends on the game, really. On something like Uncharted, I don't know, they want to keep you immersed in the story, so that's more important. Or something like Call of Duty, the story is maybe not as important in the moment-to-moment fun of shooting things. I mean, it's the first couple Uncharted games, the gunplay wasn't very good, but the story kept you moving, and Call of Duty maybe, well, the stories of the older ones were pretty good. I don't know about the new ones, but it's the gameplay. One needs to carry the other. There are games that I've played through because the gameplay sucked, but the story was interesting enough, and vice versa. It's just, you can't leave one behind, or else, well, there's probably a lot of games that leave the story part behind. Yeah, there's not a clear answer to it. It just depends on the project.
There are some animation students here, right? I see a couple. I think, like, in animation, we talk about believability because realism is left for filming movies, basically, and that is very difficult to match that. But I have for those who have studied animation, you have the 12 principles, and those are they're really great tools to help you achieve what I would call believability, where you get an audience on board with that this thing could work in the physical world, but it's not real. Like the 12 principles doesn't help you create something that is perfectly real.
Right.
It is an abstraction, and I think that's with games and animation in general, is that it's an abstraction of reality, no matter how detailed the simulation is. So, like if you can embrace the fact that it can never be perfectly real, you'll work a lot better and more easy and less frustrated. Because if you wanted to make it perfectly real, just imagine the level of detail you would have to go down to. It's almost impossible task.
I think tangentially, my two favorite shows on TV right now are Bojack Horseman and Rick and Morty. And those are mediums, like I think they're the smartest shows on TV right now, but they're only possible because of animation. Either like Rick and Morty live action would be weird as hell, and Bojack Horseman in live action would be like a multi-million-dollar CGI spectacle, and it'd probably still be kind of janky looking. So these things work because of animation. I think part of it is knowing, like along those lines, knowing your medium. Realism is maybe overrated. It would be great if AAA was more flexible to art styles that were not realism. And we see every year there's new trailers of some crazy high detailed multi-million-dollar face mesh that's like a little wrong, and Uncanny Valley and all that stuff. So
Did anyone see Star Citizen's face tech? Yeah, we have a couple. That's incredibly Uncanny Valley. If anyone was familiar with the term.
do we have any other questions?
Have you ever made a mistake that you actually laughed or found funny?
Yes, yes. There's a lot of videos that unfortunately didn't make it out of studios. At Guerrilla Games, we used to, when we'd have a bug that was funny enough, sometimes people would make a music video of it and show it at team meetings. But I don't have any examples of that. There was, I don't know if this is an appropriate story, but on Spider-Man 2, there was there was these scenes that you would go around and you would help people, and sometimes people would like grab your hand and give you a big handshake or run up and give you a hug. And so when we first got that tech working, lining up two characters is not the easiest thing in the world necessarily, and this was 12 years ago. So when we first got it working, one of the characters would spin around 180 degrees. One of the characters would. And so you'd get a very inappropriate looking interaction between Spider-Man and someone else. So that was really funny. I'd probably get sued if I ever showed that video. So if I had it, I don't.
Right, so we're at the end of the hour, but we can go over if there's any more questions.
Maybe just yell it out.
Behind the shelf. All right, there's one.
I can just repeat the question if you can just, or we can, all right. This will be more fun. Yes, book person.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
I want to ask about crunch time, if you've ever experienced it and how you handle it in a project setting.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of my life crunching. Let's see. That's that's kind of where the slide came up. I haven't been doing it much. DICE L.A. has a pretty good emphasis on work-life culture. There's a lot of companies that you'll go to that'll be like, oh yeah, we don't crunch much. We try to minimize it, and oftentimes they're full of crap. There was one studio I went to for one of those canceled games that I asked them about that before I went, and they're like, oh yeah, we only crunch when it's necessary. And the very first Saturday I was there, they're like, oh, the publisher's coming in, so we need butts and seats because they need to see that we're working as hard as we can on this game. So I didn't have anything to do on that Saturday, and I still had to come in and show them that I was there working. That's a whole topic. I mean, I've crunched at a lot of different studios. Is there a more specific part of it that you want to know about?
Not really. Just I was wondering generally about the difficulty of it and.
I would say the difficulty, even among professionals, there's still a lot of disagreement of if it's necessary. And my stance is sort of in the middle. I think there's sort of the good crunch and the bad crunch. I think good crunch is where, I want to get your take on this too. The good crunch is where if you worked 40 hours a week, and this is pretty much theoretical, if you had worked 40 hours a week, the feature would be done and you could ship it and it'd be pretty good. And then if you stay the extra 20 hours that week, it's going to be amazing, or 40 hours or whatever. Bad crunch is when it's working 80 hours a week is just going to get it done. It's just going to get the bare minimum. And I think the thing that people will talk about openly with crunch is that like sometimes there's bad studios that will be like, everybody needs to come in on Saturday, and that's gotten harder to do. There's been some lawsuits, EA spouse and things like that. But the more insidious one, and I think you'll find this more as it's become less okay to just ask for crazy hours, is that you're never asked to crunch. But like I said, we are creative people and we are ripe for exploitation. We want to do things good. We want to do things that people see and that we're proud of. So if I give you 8 weeks worth of work and 4 weeks to do it, I know what you're going to do. I don't have to ask you to crunch. I know that your pride is going to make you do it to the best of your ability, and it's not going to be in 40 hours a week. So that's the thing to watch out for. Is sometimes you're going to get a workload that's not possible, and it'll be up to you to fill that gap. I'm not sure what to do about that. People talk about it that maybe you need to miss some deadlines to show that it's not possible, or I don't know. But the best thing you can do is try to, when you go to a company, assess the quality of life to the best you can. But it is still definitely a fact of life for game development.
I think coming from like I own part of the company I work for. All of us who work at Rain Games, we also are owners in the company, and we still do crunch, but it tends to be, I guess, when you're doing it for yourself in a way, it tends to be less frustrating. I came from working at for somebody else in television, and there was a lot of crunch time there as well. And I think that a lot of creative professions have this problem, not just games.
Absolutely.
And if you're not invested in the project, I think it's a lot more detrimental. And like it's much easier to be invested in like an indie project where you own it, like the product is yours, you came up with the idea, all of those things, and then you want this thing to be as good as it can be. Then the crunch it feels more like worthwhile, at least to me. I guess it's individual to a certain degree. But if you're working for a big company, I think the crunch can feel more frustrating if you've been tasked with solving a problem that you don't personally think is that important, for example. And I think it's like admirable for companies like DICE where they like make an effort to say, you need to have some time off, because you lose a lot of even in my situation where when we released our game this spring, we did a lot more crunch than we should have done. At least I did, and I was on the verge of burning out. Basically, the workload was a little too much. If I had adopted some of Ryan's advice, I probably wouldn't have ended in that situation. But like, it's a sort of professional pride. I wanted to make it as good as it could be, and I wanted to wanted to finish all of the things that we have planned to finish instead of cutting them. And it's also a question of, I guess, it's both a question of the company's discipline and your own personal discipline. Because in some companies, I've heard, I haven't experienced this, but like they say that you're not required to work overtime, but we all want to make it as good as possible, right? So a lot of people work overtime anyway, and they leave it up to the individuals. And a lot of creatives aren't that disciplined with their time. It just seems to be like a general rule.
It's sort of the perfect artist trap. Like you can bait us very easily into being like, oh, here's 6 weeks worth of work, but just do it in 3, and just do it as best as you can in 3 weeks, and it's going to be 6 weeks worth of work.
What do you think is the importance in making an animation convey personality or emotion, or if it's more important for the animation to be smooth and look good?
It just depends on the circumstance. I think being smooth is overrated. It should look like what it needs to be, and so. In a lot of games, like in a lot of the stuff that we do, we have soldiers running around with different motion capture, and there's not a lot of personality in that. We've actually had actors who are amazing characters. Like when we bring in a mocap actor, we've had people who are amazing characters. Like we had this one guy who was like, oh, if we were making like the Predator game, this guy would be perfect. But this is the animation set that you're going to see all over the game, so they need to be fairly generic. This needs to be something that doesn't have enough personality to pull you out of it, because you're going to see it hundreds of times. So it needs to look good, but it needs to be sort of generic, versus if we were doing like a real boss-centric game or something. If we're doing Metal Gear and we're doing Metal Gear bosses, like that should probably have a lot more personality, because you're going to see that set once. So it just depends on the use case, really. Oh, sorry.
If I can contribute to that question, I think there's never the same thing that you have to make a trade-off. Like there's always a different sort of, depending on the situation. Like if you said like you want something to be smooth or having a personality, for example, I don't know if necessarily jittery animation conveys more personality than smooth animation does. It really just depends on what you're animating, like you said. And also,
Is that me?
no.
That was me.
But one thing that I find like it comes with experience. Like when I started animating, I tended to not think so much about the performance. I just wanted it to sort of to make everything look to make it look as good as I could, depending on because I started working a lot with motion graphics on less sort of realistic animations, and then as I had more experience with doing characters, I started feeling that conveying emotions is not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to do that many trade-offs. You can find ways to communicate like the emotions and the personality of the character even in gameplay, like even in a gameplay situation. Like, but you have to sort of find the place where it's appropriate to put that sort of personality, and it comes with doing a lot of animation. So to go against Ryan's car analogy, you have to do a lot of it. You have to actually practice the craft, and then after a while, you become able to spot where you can add the personality. And it's not one solution; it's like 100 different solutions, and then you learn how to apply them.
I would say one more thing along that line is that sometimes you'll find, especially on the scope of large games, like you might find that there are opportunities to share a lot of animations between characters, but change out the ones that give personality. Like, I'm trying to think of a good hypothetical, but one would be like if you have like an RPG and you want to have you want to be able to switch between a male and female main character, and you don't necessarily have the scope for two separate animation sets, you might find that just changing like the walk or the run, and there's some games that have done this or not done this, that like the run looks weird because the models are different. So if you could change like the run and the walk and a couple other little things to make it match the model, then that might be enough rather than having a whole new set. Or if you have two different characters with two different personalities, maybe they don't need their own walks and runs, but they have different idols or something like that. There's efficient ways to do it that aren't just one or the other.
Yes, if there's, we can have one more question from the front here. If there's no one else who wants to. Oh, we have a new question from behind here.
Yeah, just wondering how we feel about using DLC in many games who take out already implemented gameplay and otherwise, and then plant it as a DLC later on.
Uh-huh.
How do you feel? Or just planning from the start to, as some fighting games who have half the rooster already locked behind DLC?
That's a good question. I mean, it depends a lot on the game. I think that the less unclear part is that sometimes people think that like whatever we have, like if our game ships in November, that like everything that we've done any work on up until September is what we're supposed to ship. But that's not necessarily what the complete game is. When there's things like, and I don't know like the fighting game, I'm not too familiar with fighting games these days, but if it's just a matter of if part of the game is actually held back or if part of the game comes later, but it's not necessarily an incomplete experience. And like we've had cases, I'm not sure how much I can talk about this, but we've had cases where people found like a reference to some gun that isn't in the game as they see it, and they think that we've made it because that text exists somewhere. But we might know what our DLC plan is for next year, and that gun might exist in a list somewhere, but it doesn't mean we've made it, just because there's an acknowledgement for it. And also at the same time, there might be different teams working on DLC at the same time as the main game is shipping. There's a lot of, the process of shipping a game is like, especially on console, there's certifications and things like that take a couple of months. So the game is actually done quite a bit before it ships. And so DLC is a faster certification. So things can be being worked on in that October that are, they partially exist but aren't ready yet. So things like that, I think is kind of maybe a failure of games to educate people on how this stuff works. There are, of course, I think with AAA games, sometimes we get accused of holding back content, and we don't generally, but I know there are cases that kind of are. I mean, if a fighting game ships and there's 12 characters, but only 6 of them are available and you have to buy the other ones on day one, or the whole day one DLC kind of falls into like what I was talking about before. Maybe it did come later, but yeah, I don't know. There's not a clear answer to that, and there's some games where it's like they're role-playing games. You can buy this, pre-order this, and you get this extra character. Personally, I feel like that is when you're getting an incomplete experience. Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't happen nearly as often as the gaming press would have you believe. A lot of times it's like we'll start working on stuff before the game is shipped, but it's not done. It's not ready. Yeah, there's not a super straightforward answer for that one, but yeah, I think it's more companies should probably, if they have day one DLC, maybe they should release it in a month or something. But these get into like marketing beats and things like that are well out of my experience.
Just a quick question about sort of getting stuck in a problem. What do you two personally do when you're stuck? Do you like get up and out, work out? What are your coping methods for being stuck with a very specific problem?
Do you want to start on that one?
Depends. I'm not known as be a very disciplined person. Sometimes I just will bang my head against the problem for too long. Getting up and out can help. Usually, I find the best way to deal with a problem is talking to other people, just having a discussion, formulate the problem in a different way, in words, and because I work like a lot of my work is not articulated as it's just visuals, right? So I can usually break the problem down differently if I talk about it, because then it's translated into language, a different, like the visual, different from the visual language.
Yeah, I think it depends on the kind of problem, for sure. If it's like a creative problem, then talking through it, I think, is the best way. If it's a technical problem, like there's a lot of stuff that I do that is like technical animation things that there isn't necessarily somebody who's going to be able to help me with, at least in our building. So in that case, I think it's walking away. I would say that my ideal production process, which I don't know how I would possibly schedule this, would be to like animate everything I need to animate and then like put it away for a couple of weeks and then come back to it with fresh eyes. And I think that'll help with the creative side, but also the creative problem solving side. Anyone else?
Have any of you left any secrets in games, and how do you feel about them?
Yes. There's one. I think it was on one of the slides that I cut out. I talked about we've done like Easter egg reloads and stuff like that. Battlefield has all kinds of Easter eggs, and some people probably spend more time on the Easter eggs than they should. But so like we did one that was, I don't know. Sure, I'll tell the story. So we did this one that we added a certain revolver to Battlefield 4, and revolvers are kind of fun to animate because there's all kinds of different ways to do them. They're so different than other guns. And so I did it this like weird tactical reload from the 30s. It's like no one would actually do it, but it's like it works. So it was kind of a weird thing, and I'd animated the whole thing. It's like you take the revolver and you like push the cylinder out, you dump the bullets out, and then you have a speed loader with the bullets on it. And so I'd asked for the modeler to build a different one. It was like just so we'd have something different than everything else. I was trying too hard to be different and maybe not efficient. And so he built this one that has like a ring, and so you put in the bullets and then you've got this thing on your finger. And I was like, oh shit, like I'm at like 3.5 seconds of animation already. This is turning into like a really long reload. So I just went, okay, just flicks it off and then puts it in and it's done. And so that was a really polarizing animation. Like some people thought it was really cool because it was different. Some people thought it was really stupid. And so for the people who thought it was really stupid, I was like, well, I'll show you a stupid reload. So I made this really stupid reload. I stayed late on a Friday night and just made, I unfortunately don't have a video of it ready, but it's on YouTube. It's like just some dumb thing and it's just goofy. And then somebody found it. And so that was like, it got around on YouTube. And then on Battlefield Hardline, they wound up doing a lot of these. It turned into like a cool thing. They did like magic trick reloads and stuff like that. And so that was the Easter eggs for those. Those are the kind of stuff that I've done. We added one for the second year of Battlefield 4. It was like a lever action rifle, like an old cowboy gun. And people were like, oh, you have to do it like the Terminator, like the thing that he does on the motorcycle. And I was like, no, that's really irresponsible to handle a weapon that way. And people were like, no, you have to do it. And so we added this mode that if you get like 3 headshots, then you start like spinning the gun around like a cowboy. So stuff like that. So we have fun with it, but it can be tempting to spend too much time on that stuff and not enough on the stuff that matters. So it's a luxury when you do.
I propose animations of guns and stuff. One thing that oftentimes in shooters, I've always wondered why there is no like idle position. The hands and the gun is always in the frame. Is that a thing that is a thing in the industry?
I think it's more just the practical. I think with VR stuff, that's going to matter a lot less when you can look down and see what you have. But in the constraints of a screen, it's more about letting the player know what you have equipped. So in the case of like Battlefield, if you would want to know if you have your bazooka or your pistol or your medic bag before you're running around and trying to use one or the other, and you don't want to just make a mistake and like, oh, I'm trying to shoot a tank and instead I throw a bandage at it and then he shoots me. So it's pretty much just a practical constraint. We've tried, and some other games have done this now too, that we have a little bit of a spring or an offset. So instead of just being like totally rigid on screen and looking like it's painted, we get a little bit of sway, and you'll notice like it's more obvious in Battlefield 1 now that if you look down, you'll actually see the gun a lot higher on screen, and if you look up, you'll see it lower, but we never take it totally off. So there's little things we try to do to give life, but keeping it in frame just helps communicate like what you're currently able to do. It's the same with like in a not all of them do this, but I think with reload animations on multiplayer games, it's like I like to like not keep it pointed forward. That's like if you're doing this and it's not obvious at a glance that you're not able to. So if you're shooting and then you reload, then if you see your gun up like that, then you can't shoot, things like that.
It'll all change once VR is the most common form of games.
Totally. That's a whole other topic.
So I think we should maybe call it off here. If there's one last question. So we've gone quite long over. So seems.
Thank you all for being very patient.
there's one quick question. Then we.
Yeah. Back to not AVC, but Easter eggs. Is it normally the super long Easter eggs like in Battlefield 4? I remember one you had to write the code and lots of different things. Is it normally a team effort or just one crazy guy?
For the Battlefield 4 stuff, it was mostly like that particular one. It was one crazy guy. I think he had help, but I'm actually going to talk about that a tiny bit in my talk tomorrow. That bow we added wound up being the reward for this crazy long thing, and I have kind of mixed feelings about that. I don't think putting that much work into something that very few people get to see is the best value for the players. I think sometimes from the design side, you can be like, oh, this is going to be a cool thing and it's going to be this super exclusive reward. But there's probably some super exclusive reward that we could do that took 1/10 the amount of time as something as complicated as a bow, and then everybody can play with the cool new thing. So that's just my bias on it. Maybe you'll see the slide tomorrow. But
if you're gonna make indie games, then making a few Easter eggs can be good marketing. Like if your game is known to have lots of fun secrets, then that could make it interesting to like a niche group of gamers, basically. So it might be, depending on what kind of project you're making, it might be more fun for you or actually sensible from a business perspective. It really sort of depends. Know your players, basically.
Cool.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Big thanks to Ryan.
Thank you. Thanks to Aslak for helping me out on the questions and the moderating. And
yeah, and I hope we'll see you all tomorrow at the conference.
thanks for all for sitting through it. Sorry for any rambling.